Hi there, everybody. Can everybody hear me on the mic? Is that all working? Great. Hi there, my name is Amy Thornton, and welcome to this week's ACEIR Soldru seminar. This is the first of 3 seminars showcasing research on the impacts of fiscal policy on both inequality and poverty. They're based on studies by researchers from the African Centre of Excellence in Inequality Research, ACEIR. The focus today is on South Africa, but next month we are showcasing studies on Ghana and then Kenya in the month of May. Today's presentation is on the impact of taxes and transfers on poverty and the income distribution in South Africa in 2014-2015. And it is a study co-authored by Maya Goldman, Ingrid Woollard, and Jon Jellema, who is here to present. So about Jon. Jon is an economist and fiscal impact specialist currently working with the Asian Development Bank, Poverty and Social Analysis Unit. He served as an economist with the World Bank in Indonesia and Pakistan, as Deputy Director of the Commitment to Equity Institute in Tulane University, and as Head of the Fiscal Policy and Development Program at the Global Development Network. Jon has focused on welfare, poverty, equity, and policy issues for the last decade and has provided technical and poverty policy advice to governments and multilateral organizations in Africa, East Asia, South Asia, and Eastern Europe. He has led collaborations on applied methodologies for more precise estimation of the burdens created by tax instruments, a child-centric CEQ assessment framework, and an empirical engendered CEQ methodology. Before Jon starts, I'm going to hand over to Murray, but just one housekeeping matter is that because we are online, if anybody wants to ask a question at the end, we must please use the mic. So just one reminder about that. And now I'm going to hand over to Murray for a few minutes to talk about ACEIR's body of work in general on fiscal incidence analyses.
Thank you very much. And it's really lovely to be welcoming you to one in the series of the African Centre of Excellence for Inequality Research's slot in the Soldru seminar program. In our slot, we always try and pursue something thematic. And we draw in our partners from around the continent. And that's why this online way of working works extremely well and is fantastic. And so last year we presented some work out of the book that we published early last year on African inequality, different themes. And this year we thought that we would actually like to talk to our work on within the CEQ framework, within the benefit incidence framework, because for the African Centre of Excellence, this work that we did was in each of our nodes, and then more broadly, because of its success, was a way to connect the work of the center explicitly to policy, because these are incredible micro-simulation tools, if you like, that require the participation of government to get the relevant information and bridge you in to your government partners, which is exactly what the African Centre of Excellence is trying to do. Excellent research, but also bridging in. And so we got a grant from the French Development Agency to do one of these benefit incidence analyses in each of our nodes, each of our 3 nodes, and to build indigenous capacity. That's to try and break the cycle, to use like a poverty word, of these analyses, not leaving behind the capacity to actually use it in policy making. And that's one of the strengths of the African Centre of Excellence. And so we were so fortunate to start in some senses with the work that Jon is going to be presenting today, because it's an incredibly strong team. Jon was working in the CEQ at that stage, right alongside Nora Lustig, who was the director, and Ingrid Woollard, who was the other, that was the sort of ACEIR partner on this, and Maya Goldman are the best people at this type of analysis in this country. So it was a wonderful way to start, and a very good demonstration then to the rest of the continent about that. And all of the studies were published as working papers. and were launched with the involvement of the relevant ministries. And since then, there's been subsequent follow-on work. In Ghana, there was a collaboration with Oxfam, who were trying to tighten up a little bit the way they talk about development outcomes and redistribution. And there was a policy brief. In Kenya, there was follow-on work again, but more with the World Bank in this case. And so it's been very impactful. And anyway, Jon will tell you how useful these things are. We will learn from you, and it's really so lovely to have you with us today, Jon. We appreciate it greatly. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Murray, and thanks very much for the kind introduction and the kind words. Before I begin and dive into the material, of which there's quite a bit, I do want to reiterate or reemphasize Murray's very valid and relevant point about to what end do we do all this work? And I'm certainly not trying to pat myself on the back. If anybody, I would pat the steering committee, of which Murray and ACEIR was a part, and AFD, and also National Treasury, who have championed this kind of work from the very beginning. South Africa is actually, though I've never been based there, it's sort of a second home for me, both for this work, but also because of the number of really personable and easy to work with colleagues, both on the government side at UCT, at ACEIR, at SALDRU. I have never encountered yet, in all of the years that I've been doing this, a better working environment. And that includes not just the people that I work with on a day-to-day basis, but again, the government counterparts, the agencies who fund these kinds of things. They are all, for whatever reason, singularly focused on making sure this kind of research stays relevant, stays applicable, and indeed what Murray indicated about leaving capacity behind to continue to do these for each new budget cycle, for each new administration, for each new change in the weather, as it were, regarding international donor priorities and international public goods, or the lack of them. It's important that South Africa maintain its capacity to sort of be at the leading edge of this kind of applied research, and also have a strong and vociferous, which isn't to say aggressive, place at the table where these kinds of debates are being had. So I really appreciate the opportunity to join you here again today. I wish I could be there in person. Hopefully there will be an opportunity to do that again sometime soon. I don't want to waste any more time on pleasantries at the beginning. I haven't gone through one of these presentations, one of these summaries of a commitment to equity assessment in a couple of years now. And what strikes me as I opened up this material from South Africa is both the breadth and depth of the work that I'll do my best to summarize here. And if I don't do a good job, all blame is to be with me. When I do a good job of summarizing, all kudos go to my colleagues Maya and Ingrid, who were the main forces behind putting this analysis for the 2014-15 fiscal year together, and making sure that it looks good and that the analytics are sound. It's both a heroic exercise and, as I indicated, I think of incredible importance. So not only are we looking at benefit incidents, and who is able to access public goods and social services and economic services that the government might be providing, but we're also looking at the funding side. So from the point of view of the fisc anyway, from whom are we collecting revenues that we need in order to distribute, in order to generate public goods, in order to generate investments in economic infrastructure and other forms of capital in the public goods and social services that governments are responsible and fiscal agencies are responsible for executing, for generating. So I think that's both the incorporation of taxes and other fees that the government collects in order to fund these services, as well as the sort of expansive nature of the sorts of benefits and taxes that we do try to incorporate. So on the benefit side, naturally, cash transfers and grants are an important part of what the government is able to provide, but they're also at various times subsidizing certain enterprises or subsidizing certain firms, be they public or private or quasi-public. And at the same time, they're providing health and education services and water and sanitation services. And all of those we try to incorporate to the extent possible to really have a good grasp, a detailed grasp, but also a valid overview across the entirety of the fiscal program for any given year of what the government is able to do in terms of provide public services that might make an impact on inequality, that might make an impact on poverty, that might make an impact on access to those services by groups that are traditionally disadvantaged or live in areas where it's difficult to access them, and so on and so forth. And as a housekeeping matter too, I should say, there really is a lot of material coming up, and it's going to come at you fast and furious because we don't have all day. There's plenty of other important and interesting stuff to do. So I will ask that you hold questions until the very end. But if there's something which is just so hopelessly confusing, or I've mucked it up so incredibly badly that we need to pause and I need to clarify something, anybody jump on a microphone and just tell me, slow up. All right. With all that said, let me share my screen and let's get into it. I think too, I'll turn my camera off. Just so there's not too much demand on my bandwidth. I'm sure your bandwidth is fine. I'm not so sure about mine. So let me. All right. So can you all see the screen? All right. Perfect. So as Murray already mentioned, this CEQ assessment is the second of two that I'm aware of in South Africa, and there may well have been another one since then. But for the fiscal year 2011 and also for the fiscal year 2015, a CEQ assessment for South Africa was put together. And if there's time, we can get into sort of a comparison and contrast with those two different years. The 2015 CEQ assessment was very much a product of AFD's, the French Development Agency's involvement, but also ACEIR's involvement. As Murray mentioned, I was at the CEQ Institute at the time, but my colleagues, Ingrid and Maya, were really the driving forces behind the production of the 2015 version. So again, all kudos go to them. All mistakes remain with me, at least for this presentation. This presentation, I should say, is also borrowed from Ingrid and Maya. So to the extent that it's legible and readable, that's also due to their kind consideration. The steering committee was composed of ACEIR and AFD, but also, and importantly, members from the National Treasury. And I think that's something we can continue to talk about afterward. But again, that involvement and that enthusiasm and motivation from the side of government, I think is really critical. And the way that this particular CEQ assessment was generated was, I think, a shining example of just how academic and or applied economic research can really be brought to bear in policy discussions and brought to bear in discussions about development and sustainable development and what is the best way forward for South Africa, for Africa as a region, basically for the entire world. All of these fiscal tools that South Africa has, of course, every other government, every other fiscal agency has the same tools to a greater or lesser extent. So to the extent that South Africa is doing something right, you would assume that those results are applicable and replicable also in other fiscal settings and other socioeconomic settings. And it's really important then to have government counterparts on your side, not only so that South African policy hopefully can move forward, but also that South African policymakers can be ambassadors for the South African way of doing things. And to the extent that there's an evidence base which supports that initiative, I think so much the better. Oh, Okay, there we go. Had to get the right button. What is CEQ assessment? What is a commitment to equity assessment, and why do we go to this trouble? As I said, it takes a while to do. The last one you'll notice is already 10 years old, or the data behind it is already 10 years old or more. So why do we go to the trouble? Why are we 10 years on looking at the same set of charts and graphs that we put together? Isn't there anything more recent? Well, what a CEQ assessment does is to ask how much income redistribution or poverty reduction is being accomplished through fiscal policy. And more importantly than that, in addition to fiscal policy as a whole, what can we say about specific taxes? So what about the fuel levy? What about the skills development levy? What about excise taxes on tobacco and spirits? What about the income tax? What about public goods like education and healthcare? Or municipal services like waste collection and water? In addition to wanting to understanding more what the impact of those individual policy instruments are, we want to know how effective each of those individual policy instruments is. Could we do better if there was a more singular focus, for example, on income taxes? And if we were willing to reduce taxes on consumption and at the same time increase taxes on, for example, corporate incomes or on assets and financial wealth? And finally, what is the impact of potential reforms that could change the size, the magnitude, or perhaps more importantly, the progressivity of a particular tax or benefit? So what if we thought of a way to make VAT a more progressive instrument in South Africa? What would that do overall to inequality and poverty in South Africa if we were to change VAT in that particular way? Those are the four questions that it asks. And those are the four questions which it is my job to then explain how a CEQ assessment can answer those questions. But in addition, there are tons of interesting issues that tend to pop out of the analytical portion of a CEQ assessment. So once you really get into the data, once you really sort of roll up your sleeves and begin to stare at both the fiscal data, the administrative data, the macro data, and then furthermore, the micro data, you begin to realize that though these are maybe your four kind of leading questions, once you delve into the data, there are actually a whole host of other questions that are equally interesting. And I hope we have time at the end, maybe in a more sort of casual setting where I'm not just talking at you, we can discuss informally some of the innovations that were possible in South Africa, given both, again, participation on the government side, on the agencies and the fiscal operators who are generating all of this program level data, but also on the part of policymakers who are interested in seeing potentially novel reforms that can make an impact. So I sort of, in a way, cut my teeth on fiscal incidence work in South Africa. It was one of the very earliest studies that I took part in. I hope that doesn't come across in any of these slides or this discussion that we're having. But along the way, and after doing participating in the first CEQ assessment and the second CEQ assessment, I realized just how many very important issues about the size of income and the size of direct income taxes and income underreporting in microeconomic surveys or household budget surveys, as well as in-kind benefits and how we value them and how we discuss whether in-kind benefits are well targeted or poorly targeted to, for example, individuals at the lower end of the income distribution. All of those kinds of questions, which are incredibly fascinating in their own right, but again, have direct policy relevance. Many of those questions I was able to address for the first time, or they came to my attention for the first time in a meaningful way, in an empirical way, in these in the pair of South African CEQ assessments that were done. So in order to understand what kind of impact fiscal policy was having, it's useful to take a look at, well, what exactly did fiscal policy look like? And again, we're looking in fiscal year 2015. So I'm certain by now these numbers have changed. But in 2015 anyway, and using the data sources that we had available, we were able to allocate in the CEQ assessment basically 12.6% of GDP in taxes. Overall, the government of South Africa collected 24.4% of GDP in fiscal year 2015 in taxes. So what we're saying is that the CEQ assessment contains about half of the total revenue from taxes that the government collected in that year. Now, why are we only able to allocate half? Well, part of it has to do with the manner in which we attribute the incidence of taxes. So for something like a personal income tax, deciding who bears the economic burden of the personal income tax is relatively straightforward. Well, it's the person who earns the income. The person who earns the income pays the tax. For something like corporate income, though, the corporate income tax, it's definitely more difficult to decide or to make a reasonable assumption about who then bears the economic burden of corporate income taxes. Maybe corporate income taxes are passed on to wages in a particular firm or sector-wide. Maybe corporate income taxes lower the return to capital of capital owners. But then if that's the case, who are the capital owners? Is it the founder of the company, or is it a publicly listed company with shares and so on and so forth? So that's reason number one why we're typically not able to allocate all of the revenues collected in a given year in a CEQ assessment, because we have difficulty assigning the economic burden of some tax instruments. Secondly, the workhorse of the model from the microeconomic side is definitely the household budget survey. And household budget surveys typically don't do a very good job, and this is true in South Africa as well as all around the world. It's not particular to South Africa. Household budget surveys typically don't do a very good job of capturing very high incomes. And even among not so very high incomes, but high incomes, middle incomes, and low incomes, there is a tendency to underreport or misreport incomes, perhaps because they're highly seasonal, perhaps because employers make up certain contributions to those incomes, and when an employee is asked what was your income for the given year, he's reporting income without those employer contributions, and so on and so forth. So for both those reasons, we typically don't capture all of the revenues collected in any given year. That's also true of countries with significant natural resource rents or extractive industries. On the expenditure side, we did a little bit better, at least in fiscal year 2015. So social spending and as a whole was 17.6% of GDP. We captured 14.7% of GDP and do a pretty good job on the social spending in particular. So social protection spending that we allocate worked out to 3% of GDP, whereas actually overall in fiscal year 2015, social protection spending was 4% of GDP. We also allocate subsidies when they're available. We allocate education and healthcare spending. And as you're looking down this table, I'm sorry that the font is a little bit small. You'll see that we did a reasonable job as well on education spending, on health spending. Not quite such a good job on the housing subsidies, so the housing development grant. But there are reasons for that as well, which we'll come to later. Or sorry, we did do a good job on the housing development grant. It was rather the urban spending for urban initiatives, including the municipal grants for garbage collection services and water. But we'll come back to that as well. So typically in a household budget survey, which again is the workhorse for attributing the incidence of benefits as well as taxes, we do a better job on the expenditure side just because grants, for example, in social protection, if you're missing high income individuals, they would be missing from rosters for people and households eligible for those programs anyway. And for education and healthcare services, people at higher ends of the income distribution typically opt out much sooner, for example, private education services or private healthcare services. and certainly for privately arranged housing services. With all of that fiscal information and with the household budget survey in the back of our minds, what we do in order to complete a CEQ assessment is to build a set of income concepts. And build in this case just means, generate an algorithm in Stata, or you could even do it in Excel if you prefer to work that way. An algorithm for constructing a set of kind of hypothetical income concepts that contain more or less of the fiscal instruments that we just discussed. So you can think about what the CEQ assessment calls market income or pre-fiscal income as an income that the individual or the household would enjoy even if there were no fiscal apparatus whatsoever. So only the income that the household is either able to earn or receives from assets that the household holds, or receives from, for example, remittances from abroad, from other household members, or private transfers from within communities, or alimony payments. Anyway, all of the private income sources that are free of any kind of benefits or spending, or without taxes taken away from those same private income sources. Beginning at the top, then we can think about, well, from pre-fiscal income, what is the first set of what are the first set of fiscal transfers or taxes that we might consider? Well, an obvious one is income tax, right? As soon as you have income, assuming it's above the threshold, then probably the government, the fiscal, will come around and be wondering how much income you earned, and therefore how much income you owe back to the fisc in the form of personal income taxes. But there also could be contributions to the unemployment insurance fund, to the skills development levy, to the compensation fund. Sorry, the UIF is not the unemployment insurance fund. Sorry, it is. And the compensation, the workplace death and disability compensation fund. Those are also taxes or quasi taxes, social security contributions that come directly out of income. So that's kind of level number 2 if we're going down from the top. Level number 3, after subtracting direct taxes, we might think about adding back in direct transfers. So in particular, the social grants, the housing subsidies, if we can monetize those, the free basic services, and add those back in as fiscal items. If we did so, we'd end up at disposable income. At the 4th level, from disposable income, when we use our disposable income, go to the store to buy clothing, to buy food, to buy all of the other sort of daily necessities, we will encounter, though we may not see it explicitly, we will encounter the fiscal system again whenever there are consumption taxes. So in particular, VAT or excise taxes, or in South Africa, the fuel levy has been and remains an important source of revenues. And we can add those in, we can subtract those from disposable income. And to the extent that there are any subsidies, we can add those subsidies back in to disposable income in order to arrive at consumable income. So consumable income, if you want to think about it, is disposable income net of any kind of indirect taxes or indirect subsidies that one either pays or receives when one does one's own consuming. Finally, to reach the last level, which we're calling final income, we can add in the value, and we'll get to how we calculate this value, of in-kind transfers. So in most fiscal settings, those in-kind transfers begin and end with education and healthcare services. In South Africa, we also try and add in urban services in urban settings, and the near cash housing development program. We've experimented with adding it both as an in-kind transfer and as sort of a subsidy or a direct transfer, direct cash transfer. In the end, decided that it made more sense as a direct transfer. We can discuss that later too. But if it were actually housing being provided rather than the deed to a house some time ago, then we might include it instead in the in-kind transfer section. And once you've built up these income concepts, one of which is completely free of fiscal elements and the others containing more or fewer of these fiscal elements, we can then measure poverty and inequality sort of before and after each one. So take a measurement, take an estimation of inequality at market income or at private income, then subtract direct taxes and say, after we've taken these direct income taxes away, what then does our inequality estimate show? Is inequality reduced with the application, with the collection of income taxes, or is it in fact increased? And if we do that after each income concept or after the addition or subtraction of each fiscal element, then we can know exactly the impact that each of those fiscal elements is having on poverty and inequality. So I've already mentioned our workhorse is a household budget survey, and in fiscal year 15, we were working with the living conditions survey to understand the micro foundations of policy incidents. So lots of behaviors are observable in the living conditions survey, as well as other household surveys available in South Africa. And those behaviors, both demand behavior, but also, of course, schooling behavior, health-seeking behavior, healthcare-seeking behavior, they reveal a number of individual or household level interactions with those same fiscal policies that we were just talking about. So it's really the linchpin of the incidence model. Trying to build up an incidence model without consulting the microeconomic or micro data sources isn't really a fiscal incidence model at all. It's a fiscal incidence simulation. So that's why the household side data is so important. Just as a quick caveat, in fiscal year 2015, the LCS didn't sample 1/3 of Gauteng province, leading to low consumption coverage, also low income coverage, relative to the income and expenditure survey from fiscal year 11. That's neither here nor there. We have fixes for this, and we can dive into those later if it's of interest. So in addition to the LCS from FY15, I've already mentioned, we need a whole lot of data, and a lot of that data is dependent on or is gatekept by counterparts in government. And that's not just at the federal level. Sometimes it's at the state level, sometimes it's at the municipal level. Sometimes there are research institutes affiliated with or working as working on the side of fiscal policy itself, who will hold these records. But anyway, we need budget information and lots of it. And the more disaggregated, of course, the better. If there are, for example, 2 different types of primary schools, then we would like to have information on expenditure, on the number of teachers, on the number of pupils, on the extent of capital expenditures or capital outlays for both of those types of primary schools. And then it probably goes without saying, in addition to primary schools, we'd like the same kind of level and detailed information for secondary schools. And to the extent that tertiary education or post-secondary education is supported by fiscal outlays, then we would like that kind of information as well. Tax records are absolutely essential. An input-output table is always nice, and I'll put that to the side for the time being. It's always nice to have. Fortunately, in South Africa, there's a robust tradition of generating and updating input-output tables. Housing costs, we want information on how many students were enrolled in a particular year, and more importantly, how many of those students went to public education institutions or private education institutions that were nonetheless supported in some way or another by public funds. Healthcare visits, again, to public providers, most important, but the division line between publicly provided healthcare services, publicly funded healthcare institutions, and private practices and services acquired privately is not so clear. So it's good to have a broad overview of the healthcare sector in particular before beginning to develop your incidence model. So in addition to the LCS, we need a whole host of information, and it's really not possible to gather all of this information without the help, assistance, and more importantly, the support and enthusiasm of individuals on the government side. The weakness and the caveats that we always go over when discussing CEQ assessments and summaries of CEQ assessments and summaries of fiscal incidence work is that it's point in time only, right? So I've been discussing fiscal year 15, and previously it was fiscal year 11. It's retrospective, and it's looking only at fiscal outlays and revenues collected during that period from 1st of July 2014 to June 30th, 2015. I'm not sure that those are the actual dates for the fiscal years in South Africa, but if they are, you get my drift. For 365 days of the year, we don't try and incorporate any of the longer run impacts of, for example, infrastructure spending. We don't include infrastructure spending at all, again, because of the incidence issues. But we also don't for infrastructure spending, also for education spending, also for healthcare spending. Healthcare spending, education spending, all of those different expenditures may in any given year, of course, have impacts beyond the year in which they are spent or in which they are executed. We don't consider any of those. It's a point in time analysis and it's retrospective. So the ability to simulate reforms does sort of undo this insistence on point in time and retrospectivity. But nonetheless, we think that's a small price to pay for generating this completely flexible model of the way that fiscal policy impacts kind of welfare outcomes that we care about in real time. Now I say in real time, we're already 10 years on from fiscal year 15, but nonetheless, assuming many of the same policies are still intact, covering many of the same individuals with similar characteristics, it's not too much of a stretch to say we imagine that without major revisions to sort of operating procedures and new programs and so on and so forth, that the behaviors and the impacts that fiscal policies were having in 2015 will likely be very similar. That's without considering the size of those policies, which we'll see later is very important. As we've already discussed, it excludes, a CEQ assessment typically excludes important categories of tax spending, so corporate income taxes being a sort of glaring data gap, as well as infrastructure spending. Infrastructure spending, of course, in South Africa as elsewhere, is often a big chunk of primary spending. So to avoid it entirely, or to say, we're just not really good enough to allocate the incidence or the economic benefits to individuals and households of this infrastructure spending is also, I don't want to say it's a glaring weakness, but it is certainly a weakness. And in South Africa, in fact, we've developed some ways around that and very, I think, exciting ways to make good on the promise of using a CEQ assessment or a fiscal incidence assessment to really be able to return to government what are the welfare impacts, but also the growth impacts of your entire fiscal policy portfolio. So excluding infrastructure becomes difficult to have conversations about the entire fiscal portfolio because you're missing such a big chunk. Education and health services are valued at the average cost of provision. That, of course, may or may not reflect in any way the value or the sort of marginal productivity gains that individuals who access those services achieve. It may not have anything to do with their willingness to pay for those services if they had to acquire them on the private market. And it's not even clear that the average cost of provision for government is a reliable signpost to the average cost of provision, for example, for a private provider. But nonetheless, it's very difficult to think of anything better. And that's something we can also discuss as well. We've already discussed the sort of average weaknesses or the default weaknesses of most household budget surveys or household surveys in general. So no need to belabor that. All right, all of that front matter aside, what do we have for results in South Africa? The most important, or the first question that we posed is how much income redistribution and poverty reduction is actually being accomplished through fiscal policy in South Africa. And you'll remember that we we showed you kind of a flow chart of the creation of income concepts. Here is an estimate of the Gini coefficient at each of those income concepts. So starting on the very left-hand side, we have this notion of pre-fiscal income, which is uncontaminated, if you want to call it like that, by any kind of fiscal policy. Neither taxes nor transfers are included. And as you probably are all aware, at least in fiscal year 15, I don't think it's changed very much since then, South Africa measures as one of the most unequal countries, excuse me, in the world. So a Gini coefficient of 0.73 is kind of off the charts. And we'll see how that compares in international context when we compare the South African impact of fiscal policy with all of the other countries which have done a CEQ assessment. From pre-fiscal income, moving all the way over to the right in one large jump, we see that at final income, or after the addition of in-kind transfers for education and health in particular, the Gini coefficient has dropped by a full 23 percentage points, or 23 Gini points, to 0.50. So that's pretty, I mean, that is very impressive. And skipping ahead just one slide, I'll come back to the previous one. That is the largest single drop in the Gini coefficient or in inequality from fiscal policy of all of the countries that are currently in the CEQ database. So all of these CEQ assessments have been archived in a way, and they're in a database now, which can be accessed online. So you can see what the impact of fiscal policy is for all of the countries that are in that database. And you know that the impact of fiscal policy has been generated in the very same manner. In other words, using the CEQ assessment framework and not doesn't have idiosyncrasies in terms of method. So that's impressive. South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world, but nonetheless, and perhaps because of that highly unequal private income, uses fiscal policy in a very effective manner to reduce inequality, to reduce existing inequality, so that post fiscal policy income inequality is reduced by quite a chunk. Spain should be in there as well. I think it's in this graph, Spain would be on the left of Argentina. So there's no country that really even comes close. Yeah, Argentina is second, but its total inequality reduction from fiscal policy is more like 17 percentage points, not over 20. In the interest of time, I'm just going to keep moving ahead because there's still lots of interesting material to get to. What about poverty? So fiscal policy in South Africa was responsible for a huge drop in inequality, at least measured by the Gini coefficient. What about poverty? Well, also for poverty, South Africa uses fiscal policy in a pro-poor manner and does, in fact, reduce the rate of poverty measured at the food poverty line, measured at the upper bound, measured at the lower bound, from elevated rates from 40 to 60% at pre-fiscal income, or if we're thinking only about private income sources, to more like 30 to 60% if we're thinking about post-fiscal income. And in this case, post-fiscal income stops. We don't go all the way to final income because you can't eat the in-kind services that we've been talking about, right? Education, we've determined that, or in order to put a financial value and economic value on it, we've said we will value a year of education at the primary, secondary, tertiary level at the government's cost of provision. Nonetheless, an in-kind transfer can't be transformed into anything else. You can't transform a year of education into more clothing, into more heating, into more food. So for that reason, when we're looking at poverty statistics and the impact that fiscal policy has on financial poverty, we stop the diagram, or we stop the flow chart, as it were, at consumable income, all of those things which are cash or near cash transfers. It's not all practitioners like this very much, just like infrastructure, education, and healthcare services often are a huge chunk of the primary spend. And so to sort of ignore them entirely, or to ignore their impact on poverty reduction is a little bit, I don't want to say misleading, but it begs the question. well, if we're, if we spend so much on these particular items, certainly these must be having a positive impact on lower income individuals, especially if we're able to generate primary, secondary, tertiary education that reach a lot of lower income individuals. And there are ways around that as well, but purely for financial poverty, we sort of stop the ticker at consumable income rather than final. So also in terms of in international context, South African fiscal policy, at least in FY15, was very efficient at reducing poverty. And in fact, there was only one other country, Iran, in fiscal year 2011, who managed to use fiscal policy in a more effective way at reducing poverty than South Africa. But caveat, Iran, of course, doesn't have to worry. So at least in fiscal year 2011, didn't have to worry about collecting revenues from tax instruments. I say didn't worry. They still, of course, had tax instruments, but crucially, they had a lot of government revenues available from extractives and natural resource royalties. That continues to this day, and that, of course, has a big impact on poverty reduction, in particular from fiscal policy. Nobody has to pay out of their pockets for revenues that are acquired by the fisc from natural resources or from extractive industries. So South Africa is very efficient for a non-extractives country at reducing poverty through fiscal policy. Nonetheless, even though in international context, South Africa looks quite impressive, it's still a highly unequal place. So all of those the red is South Africa, and you'll remember the large drop in inequality from pre-fiscal to post-fiscal income. All of those other blue countries, those blue lines are countries which are represented in the CEQ database, and it traces their fiscal policy impacts on inequality from pre-fiscal to final income. And you'll notice, most of these countries have much flatter lines, but B, they begin with pre-fiscal income inequality much lower than South Africa's and end with pre-fiscal income inequality that is not actually significantly lower or significantly higher than income inequality in South Africa. So the lesson that I take from this, and this is, it's sort of a Rorschach test, these international benchmarking graphs. Some people see how much work South Africa has left to do. Other people, and I am one of them, see just how difficult it is for the public sector to really make a dent, a meaningful dent, a dent that's meaningful in international context, in elevated inequality that stems from primarily private market transactions. Naturally, there are institutional features and policy features which have an institutional or historical trajectory, which also impact, of course, pre-fiscal income inequality in South Africa. And we certainly don't have time to go into them, and others, the CEQ assessment is not the tool to unpack all of those. But given South Africa's history, institutional, political, and otherwise, the ability of public policy today to really take a bite out of income inequality is limited. You'll see other countries don't have to try nearly as hard to reach the same level of post-fiscal income inequality that South Africa achieves. It's sort of similar on the poverty side, and here we're looking at the 250 a day PPP poverty line, not the national poverty lines. But less extreme, I guess. The rate of poverty measured at these international lines in South Africa, at least in FY15, was not kind of middle of the pack, middle of the road, and the fiscal policy reduction in poverty is also kind of middle of the pack, middle of the road. So even though South Africa uses fiscal policy pretty efficiently to reduce poverty overall, in an international context, it still doesn't look like it's a world beater by any means. And again, I think that has to do with, I am one of the people who believes that has to do with institutional features that outlive, for example, a fiscal year, and not so much the inefficiency of fiscal policy in a given year. But that's
Sorry,
something
John.
Yes.
Just a reminder that it's 10:02 and we still would like to work in some questions. So I'm just wondering
Yeah,
how much
absolutely.
further you've got. Okay, great.
Yeah, I'll try to hurry it up. The rest of the presentation basically goes through each of the taxes and transfers that were relevant for South Africa in FY15 and estimates and then discusses each individual policy's impact on inequality and poverty. And I think what I can do in order to save time for question is to move all the way basically to the very last slide, which is a summary, a very concise summary of the different policy instruments and their impact, in this case, on inequality. So on the left-hand side, from top to bottom, you have all of the different individual expenditures in blue and taxes in orange that the CEQ assessment considered. So there's the care-dependent grant, there's the foster care grant at the very top, and at the very bottom, you start getting into more of the taxes like VAT, the fuel excise, the fuel levy, and excise taxes. And what these bars, horizontal bars, are showing is the individual marginal impact of this particular policy or program on inequality. So the care-dependent grant has one of the largest impacts on inequality, and VAT has one of the largest negative impacts on inequality. VAT, the indirect effects of VAT at the very bottom of the graph, actually increases inequality, and that increase in inequality from VAT, the indirect effects of VAT, is actually larger than any of the other increases in inequality from the other taxes. So this is the endpoint of all of the fiscal incidence modeling and all of the working backward from the behaviors evident in the microdata to the fiscal magnitudes and program level information that you have kind of at on the fiscal economy side, together with the macroeconomic data that provides a guide to the sort of size of the economy overall. This is the end result. You can put each of these, each of the policies that's relevant for South Africa in terms of their progressivity, in terms of their marginal impact on inequality. I don't have it here, but in terms of their marginal impact on poverty, and so on and so forth. And from this kind of table or graph, you can then begin discussing, well, what is it about the care dependency grant that allows it to have that allows it to have a larger impact on inequality than, for example, the foster care grant or the child support grant? It's actually the other way around, because this measures only progressivity and not final impact. But that's something the CEQ assessment can generate as well. So a better question that this graph invites is, even though the care dependency grant is more progressive in terms of its distribution, more pro-poor than the child support grant, why does the child support grant itself have a larger impact on poverty? And the reason is the impact of any one program has to do with both its magnitude, so the fiscal outlays, the total size of the fiscal outlays, as well as its progressivity. And you won't be able to predict impact on inequality or impact on poverty without considering both of those things. You can have a very progressive instrument, which is nonetheless very small, which has almost no impact, for example, on poverty. And you can have a not so progressive, but still moderately progressive instrument for which spending is very large, and that can have a larger impact overall on poverty reduction or inequality than a smaller instrument. So I'm sorry to have taken such a long time in the front matter, and sorry for blowing ahead recklessly to the very end slide. But let me end it here, and that way we still have time for questions.
Great, thank you so much. Because it's almost 2 o'clock, I think what I'm going to do is just, in case people have post 2 o'clock commitments, including myself, I'm just going to give people a chance to leave if they need to. But otherwise, if you want to stay for questions, I'm going to hand over to Charmaine. And otherwise, just thank you very much, John, for such an interesting presentation. Great.
Thank you very much, Jon, and thank you Amy as well. We have a couple of online questions. Maybe we can quickly get through those, and then I'll check in with the room if there are questions as well. Jon, we have a question around, have you calculated the impact of the SRD grant? But I think the SRD grant probably came after you did this analysis. But yeah, that's one question. Another one is whether there's a specific reason why the inequality and poverty calculations were done before survey reweighting, and what is the impact when survey weights are applied? Can I hand those two questions to you first?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not even sure what the acronym SRD stands for. So I guess that means it was not part of the fiscal portfolio in FY15.
Yes, it's the social
not a very
relief
nice
of
answer.
distress grant, social relief of distress grant that came with COVID.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that, I mean, that's another source of, I'll use the question as a sort of springboard. It's another source of very fascinating sets of results around the world, not just in South Africa. Many CEQ assessments were done right before COVID, and then sometimes there was a follow-up afterwards. Sometimes in a couple of countries there was a follow-up during. But yeah, the SRD grant is not included because of the timing. Had we done it in one of those COVID years, or if the information was available, we certainly could have incorporated it. And an SRD grant, something temporary or something that was meant to sort of bridge the time pre to post COVID, would be a good thing, or would be a comfortable exercise in simulation. If you already have, for example, this fiscal incidence model at the ready, it would be relatively easy to use kind of operating procedures and targeting principles for the SRD grant to bring that into in a simulation the existing fiscal incidence model and make some guesses as to what impact that SRD grant is likely to have. The question about inequality and using the survey weights, we definitely did use the survey weights to generate estimates of inequality, but then we noticed, and this is one of these innovations that I was talking about earlier, that according to the LCS, and this is true of many household surveys, the number and weight of high income individuals was too low relative to the information that we had from the tax administration. So we had micro data from the tax administration itself, from National Treasury itself, and that gave us a better sense of the true distribution of not only incomes, but also income taxes paid at the very top end of the income distribution. So obviously the tax admin data is not going to be collecting a lot of information from lower income individuals, but those who are the individuals who are visible to the tax authority, their information, particularly on incomes and income taxes paid, will be available. So we did some work afterward trying to calibrate the incomes at the upper end of the income distribution, as well as the income taxes paid, with the information from the tax microdata. And that changed a little bit our estimates of the inequality, pre-fiscal income inequality, but also the impact on inequality of direct taxes. So pre-fiscal income inequality went up a little bit, but the impact of direct taxes in particular also increased a little bit. So that overall, at post-fiscal income, the drop in inequality overall was more or less the same. But that's an interesting nuance that we did indeed try to incorporate.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions in the room. Going to the first one.
Hello. Thank you so much for a great presentation. If it's okay, can I ask two questions or two questions? Sorry. The first question is just, I'm trying to wrap my head around the caveats at the beginning that you were highlighting about that the CEQ only gets kind of half of the taxes, and then you kept highlighting that some things are kind of missed out, and that's part of the framework. So you're very kind of upfront about that. But I want to understand kind of the the implications of that for example, the comparisons with other countries, and how much we can kind of really understand, we can make a kind of global assessment of the fiscal, the budget on these things. And specifically, I mean, I'm sure the alternative you have is to kind of make some assumptions, as kind of I think other papers do, on, like, you know, fitting to a Pareto distribution to get the high income individuals, or making some assumptions about the incidence of the corporate income tax. Of course, that comes with trade-offs, but if you can just talk a bit to that. And then, if it's okay, my second question is just about, so for example, for the transfers for education, health, housing, I know you said that you take the kind of average cost or something, but of course there's, I think, as you mentioned, a quality dimension to all of those things. And just what kind of, which direction do you think missing out the quality component would push all of these kind of final results in? Thanks again for a great presentation.
Over to you, Jon.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think both these questions are spot on. And I hope I didn't, I hope I wasn't too much of a grumpy Gus about what's not included in a CEQ assessment. It's so, it's not for lack of trying. That's for certain. It's just that when I'm talking about corporate income taxes in particular, infrastructure is a little bit easier, but corporate income taxes in particular, naturally, you know, the size of corporate income taxes varies as you go around the world, but also the assumptions about who bears the economic burden of corporate income taxes changes, or in my opinion anyway, is likely to change significantly depending on kind of socioeconomic context, but also the sort of financial infrastructure and ecosystem that is prevalent, or that is kind of the default in any particular country or socioeconomic setting. And what we've kind of all agreed on, not explicitly, but just as a matter of practice, is that ignoring corporate income taxes is not ideal, but any other assumptions or any other model which incorporates them is likely to be so highly idiosyncratic that the negative externality in terms of comparability and validity, for example, of external comparisons, is likely to suffer by just as much as if you were to include corporate income tax. So it's not really a satisfying answer, but I think it doesn't come from, or that default doesn't come from a lack of consideration or lack of thoughtfulness. And there are a couple of examples where the data was available. So I'm thinking of Chile in particular, I think also maybe Venezuela or Uruguay, where corporate ownership structures are visible in the data. And also in the household budget survey. And there, in those countries, it's much easier to say, okay, we are going to assume that corporate income taxes, that corporate owners bear the economic burden of corporate income taxes. And furthermore, we know who those corporate owners are. So there are a few situations where the data exists where you can actually do this. And then you don't have to ignore corporate income taxes. On the kind of, on the quality element of, and on infrastructure, I think there are a couple of examples that I know of in Mali, and where else? There was one other country where basically they took all of the capital expenditure on infrastructure for any given year, also operations and maintenance, and basically just distributed it equally to everybody in the household survey. So that's a way of incorporating it without really saying what the actual impact on inequality is, right? Certainly, that may be the best kind of default assumption that's available. But I think now with kind of geolocation data available, and in fact, in another one of the ACEIR countries in Kenya, not for the World Bank, but for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, we tried to use geolocation data in Kenya, also in, what was the other country? Yeah, geolocation data in Kenya, to better understand what kind of benefits, in particular, public pedestrian infrastructure spending would have in Nairobi, and who exactly would benefit from these infrastructure projects, because we knew where they were going and what they were for, and so on and so forth. So infrastructure is also possible to incorporate in a much more specific and I think relevant manner than maybe corporate income taxes, or it's more often possible. Let's put it that way. On the quality issue, no, you're absolutely right. And that's another area where some progress has been made, but much more progress needs to be made. So the conventional wisdom, and I share it fully, is that a dollar of public education spending doesn't produce the same quantity of effective years of education in a very poor or remote area than a dollar of public education spending would in a not so poor and not so remote area. And the only way to get around that in an empirical way is to have some measure of outcomes. And so there are countries which have taken, for example, test scores as a measure of quality and redone, or not redone, but simulated this quality element to education spending, to healthcare spending, as sort of a technology parameter in order to better understand the impact of a dollar of education spending, public education spending, might be different depending on where you're located, depending on what outcomes are kind of averaged in your area. But too few countries have done it that way, and I think more countries should do it that way. Because you're absolutely right. National averages and the national cost of provision hide considerable variation in sort of the quality, but more importantly, the outcomes, and even probably more importantly than that, the eventual returns to those years of education.
Thank you, Jon. I think we have a very captivating audience, but how is your time? It's almost 10 past the hour. Can you stay a few more minutes? There's one online question. I don't know if there's one more question in the room as well. Can you stay a little bit longer with us, Jon?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to give you the online question quickly. To what extent does the limitation of household surveys, excluding the rich, affect the inequality impacts? I think if you can answer that, please.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked. There is a slide in the appendix, as far as I recall, where we look at exactly that. So here's a quick overview of what happens when you reweight for the missing rich. So on the very left-hand side, you have the cumulative income by decile for individuals in the tax microdata. And you'll notice that for the very richest decile, their cumulative income is much, much higher than if you're looking at the set of columns right to the right, where it says survey. The individual the incomes in the richest decile in the survey are much, much lower than the incomes in, oh, sorry, these are income taxes paid. My fault. So if you're looking again by decile in the tax admin data, you'll see that the taxes paid, particularly for the richest decile, far outpaces what the survey says. So people in the survey indicate that they pay taxes at a rate, people in the richest decile in the survey indicate that they pay taxes at a rate which is far, far, far lower than what the tax admin data actually indicates. So what we did is to kind of reweight those very high income individuals such that on the very right-hand side, you have the adjusted survey and the income tax paid by those individuals in the adjusted survey, where we're trying to mimic the distribution of taxpayers and their taxes paid that we see in the tax microdata. And the end result of all this jiggering around is the following. So this reweighting impacts inequality, in fact, very little. So those very high income individuals, they do indeed have very high incomes, but there are still very few of them, right? So the great mass of of individuals. We didn't look at a histogram, but those very high income individuals, they're still only 0.001% of the population. So in a global sense, this reweighting doesn't actually do much in terms of pre-fiscal and post-fiscal income inequality. You'll notice though that it does go up, right? So from 0.72 to 0.73 on the pre-fiscal side, and actually goes down, generates a larger impact on inequality overall from fiscal policy than without the reweighting. Or no, sorry, 0.50 to 0.49 is without reweighting, and 0.50 is with reweighting. So the impact is the same. It doesn't do much either for actual pre-fiscal income inequality, just because there are so few individuals at those high income levels. Over.
Thank you, Jon. We have two more questions.
Sure. So actually on this graph, I want to know, how do I interpret the lack of change in the Gini coefficient of 0.63 between the direct transfer and then the indirect tax? I mean, you've got VAT included in your indirect tax, and if we consider VAT to be regressive, yeah, just if you can share how I should be interpreting this lack of change.
Okay. Similar question in terms of interpretation. I also noticed in terms of the poverty reduction index, I think it was, or graphs, I noticed there was quite a few countries that had negative poverty impacts, including Tanzania. And I just wanted to understand that a little bit better, if Gini coefficients are all going down. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll actually take the second one first, because I think then it helps to explain the very good question about why the Gini coefficient isn't moving between direct transfers and indirect taxes. So you're right that on that benchmarking graph, we had several countries in which fiscal policy has a negative impact on poverty, meaning it increases the poverty headcount rate. And that's not uncommon, especially in lower income settings where, because we're stopping the ticker, as I said, at consumable income, and not going all the way, not trying to, not assuming that households somehow capture the financial value of in-kind services. And in lower income settings and in fiscal settings where indirect taxes in particular make up the majority of all tax revenues. So not in South Africa, but in most middle and lower middle income countries, indirect taxes like VAT, excises, fuel levies, et cetera, make up 2/3 to sometimes even 3/4 of all indirect tax revenues. And very little is being collected from direct taxes, either personal or corporate income taxes. And as a result, when you have sort of an embryonic social protection system, or very few and scattered direct transfer programs with very limited coverage, as well as basically all of your expenditures or all of your budget being funded from indirect taxes, then the calculus, especially when it comes to lower income households, it's very difficult to manage, because indirect taxes accrue to consumption transactions, and consumption transactions generally are a much higher proportion of income overall for lower income households. They begin to look very regressive, particularly in settings where fiscal settings or social settings, whatever you want to call them, where there isn't much available on the benefit side, on the cash or near cash benefit side. And that describes Tanzania as well as lots of other middle and lower middle income countries in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia, also in South Asia. In fact, in Pakistan, where I've been now for a few years, the tax system overall, the incidence of taxes, both direct and indirect. So when you measure total taxes paid relative to pre-tax income, the incidence of total taxes in Pakistan for the first decile, in other words, the poorest 10% of households, is exactly the same as it is for the richest 10% of households. So you can imagine in other settings where it's not quite so regressive as it is in Pakistan, where when you have a lot of income being collected from revenues being collected from indirect taxes, that's very difficult for households at the lower end of the income distribution to deal with, especially when the benefit side is, again, weak or embryonic or doesn't cover many households. Also creates a lot of horizontal inequality, which we didn't have time to discuss today, but which I think CEQ assessments are a great way of. CEQ assessments can be used to show also not only the extent of vertical inequality, but how, in some cases, unfair the tax and benefit system is by treating households with similar income levels or, for example, similar demographic profiles in a very different manner because of all the loopholes and characteristics that are used for targeting, or sometimes means thresholds that are used for targeting, and so on and so forth. Coming back then to the second question, which was why doesn't inequality fall in between disposable income and consumable income when you're adding in indirect taxes? So this isn't poverty, right? This is inequality, and all that it means is the extent of inequality at disposable income is the same as the extent of inequality at consumable income once you've added indirect tax. It doesn't mean that the same individuals have the same income levels, right? So probably most of the individuals that were in the LCS in 2015 would have experienced an income loss in between disposable and consumable income, because of course, all individuals and households are gonna pay indirect taxes in some way or other. All this graph is saying is the extent of inequality after you subtract everybody's indirect taxes remains the same as before you subtracted their indirect taxes. If you look at the very next graph, and thank you for asking the question so I can show you yet one more graph, the very next graph, which shows you the evolution of poverty as you move from disposable to consumable income, you notice that indeed the poverty rate actually goes up by 4 percentage points from disposable to consumable income, and that's only because of all of the indirect taxes, including VAT, that there are in South Africa.
Great.
Over.
Thank you very much, Jon. I think we'll have to call it a day on this discussion now. The working paper is on ACEIR's website in our working paper category. Jon, will it be okay with you if we share your presentation slides with the audience? Because I think there's much interest. Thank you very much. Let's give Jon an applause. Thank you. And just to say that the next one, our next seminar will focus on our Ghana work in this field. And that's taking place on the 15th of April. So just sign up to our mailing list if you're not on it yet, or if you're on the SALDRU list, you'll also find the notice. And yes, thank you very much for everyone who stayed until the end and for a wonderful presentation, Jon. Thank you.
Thank you also for giving me the opportunity, and thanks for hanging on to the end. I appreciate it. Bye.